Hi everyone, so this is the long-awaited Avi video. It's been so difficult to make because I'm kind of responding to like 6 hours worth of content, and I learned things over the period, so yeah, it's difficult to know how to order the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is there's about 5 key points that I think are worth making. And I'm going to make those, and yeah, we'll see what happens. So I've got some notes, so I'm going to be reading a little bit from those. So one of the things that Avi had trouble wrapping his head around in one of our debates was the idea that something could sexually reproduce while not having a sexual category.
So the organism, on your view, does not have a sex despite the fact that it can sexually reproduce. Number one, what I just mentioned. So you are going to say the organism doesn't have a sex category despite the fact that it can sexually reproduce.
That seemed to throw him for a loop because so much of his debate is based off of, what will we say, based off of definitional pedantry, I guess. It's all logic nerd kind of stuff, and that's evident in the way that he begins his discussion with Riley.
How do you think is like the best way to start when we're categorizing what biological sex is?
I think we should start with the nature of definitions themselves.
Oh, wow, all right.
Yeah, of course you would begin there, and you wouldn't begin in biology because that's where your arguments are strongest, and your arguments and his arguments are weakest in the world of biology, in my opinion. So, when it comes to species that sexually reproduce but don't have a sexual category, it doesn't apply to hermaphrodites. Hermaphrodites are male and female, and we'll get to that more later. But all isogamous species, so species where the gametes are the same size, they reproduce sexually, and they don't have a sexual category. They're not male or female. They're instead divided into plus and minus mating types. And isogamous species apparently make up about 5% of all species on Earth, so they're kind of minor categories. So obviously, because they're trying to Orwellianly rewrite definitions, they don't like to use dictionary definitions of words, and they try to present dictionary definitions as though they are somehow incomplete. And I think that that's kind of weird because in my experience of dictionary definitions, like a dictionary definition might be simpler than the more complex explanation that you would get from a textbook or a person who had studied in the area, but they're never like completely different. It's never like the dictionary definition doesn't match up at all with the definition from a particular field. So when we look at the dictionary definition of sex, it says either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. Now, notice that when it says either of the two main categories, it kind of implies that there are other categories that are not included in this central binary. Interesting, isn't it? So when Avi and Riley had their discussion, Avi informed Riley that he didn't think that there was any evidence to suggest that sex was a spectrum, but he kind of remained agnostic on that issue. And the way that he was able to get Riley to chill out about that was by saying that he didn't think that this difference in opinion would result in any legislative differences or any policy changes. So yeah, it's like they don't really care what the foundation is. It's just so long as self-ID reigns, basically. And so he argued that it was more tenable to assert that sex was non-binary as opposed to a spectrum, and he gets into the differences between a spectrum and a non-binary and a bimodal distribution and that type of thing. But he still leaves Riley with some hope because he brings up some areas in which the term spectrum doesn't mean a series of options that are separated by degrees of difference. And there are examples from science or whatever where there are certain regions that are blacked out and it's only certain parts of the spectrum that work. And he also goes on to say that you can use the term spectrum to essentially mean a variety of options. So don't stop saying spectrum just when you're ever challenged on it. Say, oh no, I mean variety, which is kind of funny given that he's super... So you're allowed to use this kind of analogous definition of spectrum, but if you don't use the specific definition of binary that Avi loves, then you are speaking gibberish and should be dismissed. You're not even using that word close to correctly. So it is true that the term binary as a noun can mean a division into two groups or classes that are considered diametrically opposed. However, binary as an adjective can mean of or relating to the use of stable oppositions such as good and evil to analyze a subject or create a structural model. And the example sentence that Merriam-Webster gives, funnily enough, is actually the binary opposition of male and female. So obviously there are things that aren't good or evil, but that doesn't destroy the good-evil binary. And in the same way, there are things that may not be male or female, but that doesn't destroy the male-female binary. I also think that biological sex meets both of these definitions. However, I thought it was worth pointing out that they're super strict on how people use the word binary, but very liberal on how people use the word spectrum. Another point which I thought was pretty key is that Avi has this idea that there can be secret undiscovered sexes, and more importantly, he thinks that a single individual can define a sex. And you'll hear gender theists say this type of stuff all the time, where they'll be like, if we can find even one example that falls outside the binary, then boom, then the binary is exploded. But as we are about to see, one or even a very small number of examples does not a sex make. To address this, we turn to the Wikipedia entry on polymorphism. In biology, polymorphism is the occurrence of two or more clearly defined morphs or forms, also referred to as alternative phenotypes, in the population of a species. To be classified as such, morphs must occupy the same habitat at the same time and belong to a panmictic population, one with random mating. The example that they use is that when two groups of the same species are separated by a natural barrier, such as a dense forest, the group would no longer be panmictic, and the two groups would start to differentiate genetically. However, if the barrier were to be removed, while the species was still similar enough to interbreed, then it would once again become panmictic, and the two groups would begin to become genetically more similar. And the example they talk about here is jaguars, and there being, one morph of jaguar that's black and one morph that is a light morph that it's spotted. That's a polymorphism. And they say if the jaguar has only one possible trait for that gene, it would be termed monomorphic. It says the most common example is sexual dimorphism, which occurs in many organisms. Now, although in general use, polymorphism is a very broad term, in biology, polymorphism has been given a specific meaning, being distinguishable from monomorphism, having only one form. A more specific term, when only two forms occur, is dimorphism. So, if phenotypes were a spectrum, in the way that gender theists try to argue, where you can be sort of down this end, sort of down that end, we would be a monomorphic species. There would be one morph that could be a bit more masculinized or a bit more feminized, but it was one morph. But we're dimorphic. How many times have you heard humans being referred to as sexually dimorphic species, and how many times have you heard humans being referred to as trimorphic or polymorphic? Now, here's an interesting part. The term omits characteristics showing continuous variation, such as weight, though this has a heritable component. Polymorphism deals with forms in which the variation is discrete, discontinuous, or strongly bimodal or polymodal. The term was first used to describe visible forms, but nowadays it has been extended to include cryptic morphs, for instance blood types, which can be revealed by tests. Rare variations are not classified as polymorphisms, and mutations by themselves do not constitute polymorphisms. To qualify as a polymorphism, some kind of balance must exist between morphs underpinned by inheritance. The criterion is that the frequency of the least common morph is simply too high to be the result of a new mutation, or, as a rough guide, is greater than 1%. So Avi's operating under the assumption that if he can find, or not even if he can find, but if it were theoretically possible for a third human phenotype to exist, that this possibility in and of itself would constitute a third sex. However, sexes aren't defined by individual examples, they're defined across species. So, and I just want to go back to the thing about omits characteristics which show continuous variation. So, for example, like a skinny rhino and a fat rhino, they're not two different morphs, even though they look different, and a tall giraffe and a short giraffe aren't two different morphs. They're the same morph that's just developed in different ways. And that's kind of what the gender theists are trying to argue humans are, instead of recognizing that there are two distinct morphs, a male morph and a female morph, or phenotype. Yeah, so anyway, intersex conditions, and especially intersex conditions that have even a theoretical capacity to produce both gametes, are exceedingly rare, like 16 examples in the history of medicine type of rare. And so something this rare would not be classified as a phenotype or a morph, and it would be classed as a random mutation. And most importantly, sexes are defined by their reproductive function, and there is no reproductive function to developing ovaries inside a male body, because they're not connected to the requisite phenotype. Likewise, there's no reproductive function to developing testicles inside the abdomen of a female phenotype. Those mutations have no reproductive function, which brings us to the next point that I wanted to address, which is the difference between function and capacity. Sex categories are based around large and small gametes. So female development starts with a female dominant karyotype. It's possible to have a mosaic karyotype, where you have both a male and female genotype in the same organism. So the way Avi tries to, at one point in the discussion with Riley, he was debunking the idea that karyotype determines sex. And one of the ways he tries to do this is by suggesting that only XX and XY combinations are sexed, and so then this allows him to surprise everybody with all the other combinations. But the reality is that a karyotype is female if it doesn't have a Y chromosome, and it's male if it does. And even in the case of an XY-XX mosaicism, the exact percentage of each class of karyotype can be determined. So you'll be like 79% something and then whatever the rest. The point is, it's a mosaicism, like they don't blend. It's not like paint, it's like tiles, different colored tiles. If you've got blue and red tiles, you can see where they clearly are delineated from each other. And we'll get to the significance of that type of thing a little bit later on as well. So just to recap, XO, XX, triple X, quadruple X, all those combinations are all female because they don't have a Y chromosome. And so their function is to produce large gametes. And the way these chromosomes carry out this function is by developing a female phenotype, which are separated from male phenotypes by kind and not degree, as all polymorphs are. Female phenotypes, in turn, are female because one of their functions is to produce ovaries, and ovaries are female because one of their functions is to produce ova. And basically the same pattern applies to male development. Karyotypes that have a Y chromosome, such as XY, function to produce a male phenotype. In turn, these phenotypes function to produce testes, and the testes are male because they function to produce sperm. This is their reproductive function, which, if we remember the definition of sex, either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. However, some components have capacities which are outside their function. Obviously, function and capacity overlap to some degree, and anything which is the function of something must be within its theoretical capacity. But there are also things which are within the capacity that are outside the function. So the example I always think of to illustrate this point is how in lots of correctional facilities, things like toothbrushes will be turned into knives. So obviously the ability to stab someone is within the capacity of a toothbrush, but it's also outside its function. And yes, function does apply to organic matter. You can say the function of the veins is to carry blood around the body. It's technically possible, but highly unusual to have XX and XY in a mosaicism, but it is technically possible. Humans only have two phenotypes, and different classes of phenotypes can't exist within the same organism. It's either one or the other. And the reason this is because a female phenotype is a phenotype that wasn't exposed to sufficient masculinizing agents in the womb, whereas male phenotypes were. So there are only two options, and they're mutually exclusive. It's not as though, like Avi in one of our debates was like, could you go down both pathways? And it's like, no, you can't have, like, if the masculizing agent is dirt or oil, and the female phenotype is water, it's like the water's either clean or it's got oil in it. It can't be clean and have oil in it. This then brings us to gonads. Opposite sex gonads can exist within the same individual. It's very rare, but it does happen. There's also an article that a lot of gender theists are fond of from 1979, where they claim to have found a man who had ova developing, and from what I understand, they're misreading the article. But even if they're not, that doesn't really influence any of the debate here. So the point that I was trying to make is that the sex of a human is defined by their phenotype. It's not defined by their gonads. It's not defined by whatever gametes they may be capable of producing or not. When we're talking about the person themselves, we're referring to their body, the class of their phenotype. And a perfect example of this is XX male syndrome. This is human development that starts off with a female karyotype and produces a male phenotype and testes, which are infertile. As the name suggests, these people are male even though they have a female karyotype. And a similar thing happens with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Women with CASE have a male karyotype, but because of a complete insensitivity to androgen, oil-proof water, if we're going to reuse that metaphor, they develop a female phenotype which contains infertile testes. I also thought it would be important to kind of address the use of hermaphrodite. I've seen a few articles going around that were like peer-reviewed articles talking about how it's not appropriate to use hermaphrodite in reference to human beings anymore, and that's why the term intersex replaced it, and then that term also had problems, and so that's why differences of sexual development have replaced that term, and other variations of sexual development, other terms have been implemented. But I just wanted to go through the ways that it used to be used so people can understand when some people do use them, what they're specifically referring to. So one of the phrases that will get used is pseudo-hermaphroditism, which is cases where there's a discrepancy between the morphology of the gonads and that of the external genitalia, and that can happen in females and males. So if they've got a male karyotype and their genitals are ambiguous or unusually feminized, I guess, then that would be a case of pseudo-hermaphroditism. On the other hand, what they call true hermaphroditism refers to cases where there's the presence of both ovarian and testicular tissue in the same or opposite gonads. So what's interesting about this is that despite using the phrase true hermaphroditism, it's important to recognize that what this is referring to is something fundamentally different from a reproductively functional hermaphroditic species. And I'll try to use some diagrams and put these in later. But basically, in all humans have either a male phenotype that has, say, ovarian tissue in it, or a female phenotype that has testicular tissue in it. But it's not like the phenotype itself biologically function to reproduce both ways in the way that genuinely hermaphroditic species would, like flatworms, or what I refer to as the penis fencing slugs, which is, well, that's how other people refer to them too. Yeah, so in a species like that, what's important is they don't have one sex that's two things. They have two sexes that are one thing each. So they are male in one respect, and they are female in another respect. And this is what kind of gets us to a thing that Avi tries to do, where he's like, his whole thing about code and binaries and all that type of thing. As an example, he brings up 3 golf balls, and the first golf ball is blue, and the second golf ball is red, and the third golf ball is both blue and red. And his argument is because the blue and red are now contained within the same golf ball, they're now a third color category, or what he calls sex with respect to phenotype. But sex with respect to phenotype is just a distorted way of saying the category of the phenotype. So the red and blue ball is a third type of ball. It's not a third color in the way that, for example, if you were to combine the red and blue and have a purple ball, that would be a third sex, as well as a third type of ball. But with the blue and red equally divided, it's just a third type of ball. And the comparison is if we do the same breakdown, but instead of balls, we use documents, and instead of large and small, we use true and false. So if the first document contains only true statements, then that's true. And if the second document only contains false statements, then that's false. And if the third document contains both true and false statements, it does so, but it does so at the same time, but in different respects. And just because the true and false statements are potentially right next to each other, contained within the same document, that doesn't then break down the true-false binary. It's just parts of it are true and parts of it are false. Also, so at one point, I was trying to make fun of the way that Riley is super impressed by the fact that Avi is a doctor and seems to think that that means that he must be correct, as though there aren't doctors that are Scientologists, that there are doctors that are, like, there are scientists in Saudi Arabia that must have, you know, completely crazy fundamentalist religious beliefs. There are all sorts of doctors. The bit I was creating doesn't really fit with this video, so I'll just put the clip in here anyway, so you have some kind of context.
For example, if every scientist or the majority of scientists are using the word cat to refer to a feline, and you use the word cat to refer to a dog, your definition isn't false. It's not incorrect. You can define a cat as a dog. That's fine, but there's no point of you doing that. You're out of the consensus of what everyone else is using as a definition, and therefore it's just silly to do it. Why would you do it?
And they would
So when
also
you say
generate like absurd or like unreasonable outcomes by most people's interpretation.
Absolutely. So it's important just to differentiate that between saying that their definition is wrong.
Even Riley seems to appreciate that the explanation that Avi gave didn't really have much to do with utility. Instead, it is centered around social or scientific consensus. The problem with this is that it takes for granted that the scientific consensus is always correct. Once this has been assumed, then any definition which contradicts the orthodoxy becomes absurd by definition. I assume that this way of thinking is part of the reason why Riley promotes Avi's status as a doctor so heavily. However, it's obvious that science has often made horrific errors. Thalidomide, phrenology, eugenics, which most people mistakenly think was only popular in Nazi Germany, but at that time, that was the scientific consensus. In a lot of ways, the Nazis were very different from traditional conservatives in that there was an element of the ideology that saw itself as quite modern, and part of that modernity was adopting eugenics, as a lot of countries, including Australia, had also done.
Come for the 3 girls, Maud! No! Can't bring them up in a blackfellas camp!
No, it's my kid, mine!
It's the law, Maud.
Still, it's good to have science on our side, too.
Perhaps the most pertinent example to gender theism is the way that the entire medical establishment was taken over by the notion of lobotomies.
I present to you the lobotomy. In 1935, Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz first attempted a procedure that I now wish to make commonplace.
'Cause he's a doctor, bitch! Look it up, it's science!
Yeah, so I was trying to look for something that would make fun of the obsession with doctors, and I thought I would be able to find something like a clip from The Nanny or something, where they're like, "Ah, he's a doctor!" But instead I found something from Breaking Bad. And so I just got the, like, "'cause he's a doctor, bitch!" clip, and but then I watched that whole thing, and it turns out that they're actually talking about a very similar thing in Breaking Bad to what Riley and Avi were talking about.
So you're telling me every time Kirk went into the transport, he was killing himself? So over the whole series, there's like 147 Kirks.
At least!
Because at one point they accused TERFs of having a religious attachment to the idea of femaleness, like it is unchangeable in a way that no other, like, physical property is. And I think that, like, when it comes down to your very cells, it probably is, like, much harder to change that type of thing than any other physical property, because they're like, well, I could remove my hand, and it's like, yeah, well, you're talking about something a bit more fundamental. It's more like changing your blood type or something like that, but even that can happen, so even that's not the best analogy. And I do kind of concede that there are people who are kind of religious about that. But in the same way that there are people who are religious about being black and will say things like, I don't know, basically have kind of pseudo-spiritual beliefs about melanin and other sort of, you know, attributes of blackness. So while that does happen, it's definitely it's not a fundamental component of gender criticalness. But what's funny is, to get around it, they're like, what if there was a machine that could break you down on a molecular level and rebuild you as you would have been if you were the opposite sex? Then they couldn't possibly deny that you'd changed sex. And first of all, the idea that there is one way that you personally would have been if you were another sex is ridiculous. Like, there's not even one way that you would have necessarily been if you were the same sex. There's so many different, like, slight variations that happen. Like, would you have had Turner syndrome? Would you have, like, there's so many, like, yeah, things like that. But they don't think about that. They just, like, make me into the hot woman version of me, as though even such a thing, like, exists. It's only marginally less retarded than saying, reassemble my atoms as they would have been had I been a cactus or had I been a stingray.
I'm Pickle Rick!
But in Breaking Bad, the two, like, stoner buddies of Jesse's are sitting around and they're talking about exactly the same thing, and they're talking about how, like, when you transport on Star Trek, that's how it apparently happens. They get broken down on a molecular level. And so Skinny Pete's like, you're technically dying. Like, the old you is dead, and the new person that the machine builds is actually like a completely new person and not connected to the previous person at all. And that's why whatever character, I forget his name, doesn't want to go into the transporter or doesn't like doing it because he's a doctor, bitch. And yeah, I thought it was hilarious that these two fictional idiot stoners had a better grasp of, like, what was going on when someone was broken down on a molecular level than a doctor and his buddy.
The flower said, I wish I was a tree. The tree said, I wish I could be a different kind of tree. The cat wished that it was a bee. The turtle wished that it could fly really high into the sky, over rooftops and then dive deep into the sea. And in the sea there is a fish that has a secret wish, a wish to be a big cactus with